My dad kicked me out for being pregnant. Now he wants in after meeting the dad. I was 20 years old when my father told me I had 2 hours to pack my things and leave, not because I had done something criminal, not because I had hurt anyone, because I was 12 weeks pregnant and I had made the mistake of telling him the truth. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from right now. If this story sounds like something you needed to hear today, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because what happened after my father slammed that door is something I am still processing 2 years later, and I think you are going to want to stay for every part of it. It was a Thursday night in November. The temperature outside was 13 degrees Fahrenheit. I had been living in the same house in Minnesota my entire life, 20 years in that building, and within the span of one conversation in the living room, all of it ended. I told my father I was pregnant. I had planned what I was going to say for 2 weeks. I had written notes. I had practiced in the bathroom mirror. I sat down across from him and I said it clearly, calmly, without drama. He did not ask who the father was. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask a single question. He put down the remote control, looked at me and said, "Pack your things, you have 2 hours." My mother was sitting on the sofa 3 feet away from him. She did not say a word. She looked at the television. My brother Zephan was upstairs. He did not know what was happening. I did not call out to him. I did not argue with my father. I did not cry in front of him. I went to my room, pulled out the largest bag I owned, and I packed what I could fit. 2 hours, that was what 20 years of living in that house was worth to him. I walked out the front door at 9:47 p.m. with one suitcase, a phone at 11% battery, and $390 in my checking account. My father did not come to the door. My mother did not come to the door. The only sound I heard as I walked down the driveway was the wind. I did not look back. I called the only number I had memorized that night. My college roommate from freshman year, a woman named Bridget, who picked up on the second ring and told me to come to her apartment right then without explaining anything else. I sat on the curb in front of my parents' house and waited for her car. My hands were not shaking from the cold. They were shaking because I had just understood, for the first time in my life, that the people who were supposed to be my foundation had just pulled it out from under me without blinking. Bridget arrived in 14 minutes. She took one look at my face and did not ask questions. She just put my suitcase in her trunk and drove. That was the first night, and it was nowhere near the hardest one. I stayed on Bridget's couch for 3 weeks while I applied for emergency housing assistance. The city had a shelter for single women and families in transition, located about 40 minutes from where I had been living. I got a spot in the second week of December. The shelter had 80 people sleeping in large shared rooms, personal lockers for valuables, and a shared bathroom on each floor. I was placed in a room with 11 other women. I was the youngest one there by 6 years. I will not tell you it was fine, because it was not. But I will tell you it was shelter, and I was grateful for it, even on the nights when I could not sleep because of the noise and the smell of a space shared by too many people with too little privacy. I found my first job in January. A Chinese restaurant near downtown Minneapolis needed someone to wash dishes. $35 an hour was not what they were offering. The actual rate was $9.75 an hour, no benefits, no health insurance. I took it. I showed up every shift. I did not tell anyone at work that I was pregnant until my 6th month, when it was no longer something I could hide. By March, I had saved enough for a deposit on a one-room apartment on the north side of the city. The rent was $615 a month. The walls had water stains along the baseboards. One window had a crack that let in cold air all winter. I bought weather stripping from the dollar store and patched it myself. That apartment was mine. My name was on the lease. My father's name was nowhere on it. I applied for Medicaid in February and was approved. My prenatal appointments were covered, but the copays and the prescriptions added up. Every month I kept a handwritten ledger of what came in and what went out. There was never anything left over. I went to every appointment alone. I took the bus. The ride to the clinic was 30 minutes each way. There was one appointment in April where the doctor asked me if the father was involved. I said no. She wrote something in her chart and moved on. I appreciated that she did not push further. In the 3rd week of June, my contractions started at 2 in the morning. I called a cab because I did not have a car. The cab took 22 minutes to arrive. I checked myself into the labor and delivery unit at the public hospital, filled out the intake paperwork myself, and was taken to a room where I labored for the next 7 hours without anyone beside me. Leia was born at 6:15 in the morning. She weighed 3 pounds and 15 ounces. She was small and red and loud and completely real. The nurse placed her on my chest, and I lay there in that hospital bed with no one else in the room, and I cried. Not because I was alone. I cried because for the first time since November I did not feel like I was falling. I had something solid to hold on to. The hospital bill after insurance came to $4,200. I set up a payment plan, $175 a month for 2 years. Leia came home to the apartment with the cracked window. I bought a second-hand rocking chair from a thrift store for $12. Every night I sat in that chair and rocked her until she fell asleep. It was the only piece of furniture I bought for myself in those 2 years. Everything else in that apartment was functional. The chair was the one thing that was just for us. I switched jobs when Leia was 6 weeks old. A sit-down American restaurant in downtown Minneapolis was hiring servers for the evening shift. The tips were better than anything I had been making. On a good night, I walked out with $130 in tips alone. On a slow night, closer to 80. I worked 3 nights a week, sometimes 4 when I could arrange childcare. I found childcare through a neighbor in my building. Her name was Donna. She was 50 years old, retired, and had raised 4 children of her own. She charged me $25 an hour, and she loved Leia from the first time she held her. I do not have the words for what Donna meant to us during that time, so I will just say this. She showed up every single time I needed her to, without exception. My food assistance benefit was approved when Leia was 2 months old. $230 a month on an EBT card. I bought potatoes, eggs, pasta, milk, and whatever produce was on sale. I learned to cook things that stretched. I did not buy anything that was not necessary. During those 2 years, my mother sent me 2 text messages. The first one came 4 months after I left. "Are you okay?" I replied yes. The second came 18 months later. "Your father is not going to change his mind." I did not reply to that one. I did not hear from my father at all. There was one night in February, when Leia was 8 months old, that she spiked a fever of 103.4 degrees at 11 p.m. I did not have a car. I called a rideshare. The fare to the emergency room was $17. The pediatric emergency team saw her within 40 minutes and told me it was a standard ear infection. The total bill after insurance was $103. I paid it the following Friday from my tip money. I want you to understand something about those 2 years. I was not surviving in spite of being alone. I was surviving because I had decided that Leia was going to have a mother who did not quit. Every shift I worked, every dollar I tracked, every night I sat in that $12 rocking chair, I was making a decision. The decision was that my father's verdict about my worth was not the final one. I did not know yet that everything was about to change on a Thursday night in September, 2 years after the night it all fell apart. It was a Thursday evening in September, and the restaurant was full. I was working a double shift because one of the other servers had called out sick. By 8 p.m. I had been on my feet for 9 hours. I was carrying 4 plates to a table near the window when the host sat a new guest at one of my stations. I dropped off the plates, picked up my order pad and walked over. The man was sitting alone. He was tall even while seated, with light brown hair and the kind of posture that comes from growing up in a place where people are expected to take up space confidently. He was reading the menu, but he was reading it the way someone reads a document they have already memorized. He called out each item quietly to himself, sometimes in English, sometimes in another language I recognized after a moment as Swedish. I said good evening and asked if he was ready to order. He looked up. I did not recognize him in the first half second. I recognized him in the second half. His name was Lars. I had met him 2 years and 2 months ago at an international student networking event at the university, before I had dropped out. He was in Minneapolis for a 3-month business exchange program. We had spent 4 months together before his visa expired, and he had to return to Sweden. We had stayed in touch for 6 weeks after that, until I changed my phone number because I could not afford to keep the same contract, and the new prepaid plan had a different number. I had not had his contact information since then. I had found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after losing contact with him. I stood at his table with my order pad, and I did not move for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds. He said my name, not as a greeting, as a question, the way you say something when you are not sure if what you are seeing is real. I told him I needed a minute. I walked to the back of the restaurant into the dry storage room next to the kitchen, and I stood there with my back against the shelving unit and breathed. My manager knocked on the door after 90 seconds and asked if I was all right. I said yes. I went back out. I finished my shift. I took his order, brought his food, refilled his water twice. I did not say anything beyond what was necessary. He did not push. He left a $40 tip on a $52 bill and wrote his phone number on the receipt with one sentence: "I would like to talk when you are ready." He was waiting outside the rear staff exit when my shift ended at 11. He was not blocking the door. He was standing a reasonable distance away, and when I came out he did not approach me. He waited for me to decide. I walked over. He told me he had been looking for me for 2 years. After losing contact, he had gone back to Sweden and attempted to reconnect through mutual acquaintances. When that did not work, he hired a private investigation firm based in Minneapolis 7 months after returning home. The firm spent 14 months on the search. The total cost was over $100,000. They had located my old apartment address, but by the time they confirmed it, I had already moved to the new place, and there was no forwarding information. I listened to all of that standing outside in the September air, with my server apron still on. Then I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you disappeared and I needed to know if you were okay." I looked at him for a moment. Then I told him what I needed to say, because there was no version of this conversation where I did not say it immediately. I said, "You have a daughter. Her name is Leah. She is 22 months old." Lars did not speak for approximately 30 seconds. He sat down on the concrete step at the base of the building's rear exit. He put both hands over his face. He stayed like that for a while. Then he looked up and said, "Can I meet her?" I said I needed time to think. He said he understood. He gave me 3 days. I called Bridget that night after I got home and Leah was asleep. I talked for 2 hours. By the end of the conversation, I had decided 2 things. First, Leah deserved to know her father if her father was willing to show up. Second, I was not doing anything without legal protection in place. I contacted Lars the following afternoon. I told him I was open to moving forward but that we would do it through proper legal channels. He agreed without argument. He said, "Whatever you need, I am not going anywhere." Lars retained a family law attorney the next morning and requested a paternity DNA test. The test was completed within 4 days. The results arrived 14 days later, 99.97% match. Lars's attorney and mine, a woman I had found through a legal aid referral, began coordinating immediately. Within 3 weeks of that Thursday night at the restaurant, Lars had secured a 2-bedroom apartment for Leah and me in a safer neighborhood. The building had working heat, clean hallways, and a functioning elevator. He prepaid 6 months of rent. When I told him I was not comfortable accepting it without documentation, he had his attorney draw up a formal agreement stating it was support for his daughter, not a personal gift to me. I signed the agreement and moved in. He opened a trust account for Leah with an initial deposit of $100,000, structured so that the funds would be available to her at 18 for education or other needs. He also retained a financial analyst to calculate the full cost of what I had covered alone during the 22 months since Leah's birth: hospital bills, childcare, rent, food, transportation, medical copays. The total came to $63,400. Lars wired that amount to my account in 3 installments over the following 3 weeks. I want to be clear about something. I did not feel saved. I felt like a debt was being paid. There is a significant difference, and I knew it every single day of those weeks. The debt was not Lars's fault. He had not known, but the debt existed, and acknowledging it was the first honest thing that had happened to me in 2 years. I gave my notice at the restaurant on a Tuesday. I enrolled in the accounting program at the community college the following week for the spring semester. I was on a waiting list for a scholarship. Lars did not ask me to stop working. He did not tell me what to do with the money. He asked once what I wanted for my future, and then he listened to the answer and did not offer opinions. We were not together romantically during this time. We were 2 people navigating a situation that neither of us had expected, and we were doing it carefully, 1 step at a time. That was the situation when, on a Wednesday afternoon 13 weeks after Lars walked into the restaurant, someone knocked on the door of my new apartment. I was at the kitchen table doing coursework when the knock came. Leah was napping. I was not expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and stood very still for a moment. My father was standing in the hallway holding a bundle of grocery store flowers, the kind wrapped in cellophane with a rubber band around the stems. He was wearing a pressed button-down shirt. His hair was neat. He looked like a man who had prepared for a visit. I thought about not opening the door, then I decided I wanted to see what he was going to say. I opened it but did not step back to let him in. He looked at me and then looked past me into the apartment. He said, "I heard things changed for you. I am glad." He held out the flowers. He was smiling in the careful way people smile when they want to appear warm without committing to anything specific. He did not say he was sorry. He did not mention November. He did not reference the 13 degrees, the suitcase, the 2 hours, or the 2 years. He stood in my doorway and spoke as though the last time we had seen each other had been a normal goodbye after a holiday dinner. I looked at him. I said, "You need to leave." His expression shifted. He said he wanted to meet his granddaughter. He said something about bloodlines. He said something about what the law recognized regarding grandparent involvement. He used the phrase, "my rights as a grandfather," within the first 90 seconds of the conversation. He had not asked how I was. He had not asked how Leia was doing. He had gone directly to rights. I closed the door. Lars arrived an hour later for a scheduled visit with Leia. I told him what had happened while Leia played on the living room floor. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "He is going to come back." 2 days later, my father knocked again. Lars was already at the apartment. Lars opened the door. My father looked at Lars for a long moment. Then he said, "Who are you?" Lars said his full name. Then he said, "I am Leia's father, and you are the man who put Thessaly and my daughter on the street." He had prepared. While I had been in the other room getting Leia, Lars had gone to his bag and taken out a folder. Inside it was a printed collection of documents he had gathered over the previous weeks. The hospital billing statement from Leia's birth, the lease from the cracked window apartment, the itemized EBT expenditure records, the childcare payment logs I had kept in a notebook, photographs of the old apartment that the private investigation firm had taken during their search. He had organized them chronologically and placed them in a clear plastic sleeve. He held the folder out to my father and said, "This is what your decision cost her." My father took the folder. He held it without opening it. He looked at Lars and then looked at me. His jaw was tight. After a pause, he said, "I had my reasons." Lars did not argue the point. He said, "She did not need your reasons, she needed her father." Then he stepped to the side and said nothing else. He left the next part to me. I looked at my father standing in my doorway with those grocery store flowers in one hand and a folder documenting 2 years of my life in the other. I said, "I will have my lawyer contact you." He looked at me for a moment. Then, before he turned to leave, he said, "You should know what the law says about grandparent rights before you make any decisions." He said it in the tone of someone delivering a piece of useful information. He said it the way you would say it to a person who had overlooked something obvious. He walked out. I closed the door behind him. Lars looked at me. I looked at Lars. I said, "He did not come back for me. He came back because of you." Lars said, "Then we make sure he never has a reason to come back that does not go through you first." That night after Leia was asleep, I told Lars everything. The full account from the beginning, the Thursday night in November, the living room, my mother on the sofa, the 14 minutes waiting on the curb, Bridget's apartment, the shelter, the Chinese restaurant, the hospital at 2 a.m, Donna, the $12 rocking chair, every single thing. I had never said all of it to anyone in sequence before. I had told pieces to Bridget. I had told pieces to Donna. I had never laid out the whole 2 years from start to finish for another person. Lars listened to the entire account without asking questions or interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I am sorry I was not there." I told him it was not his fault. He said he knew that and that he was still sorry. Then he asked, "What do you need to do next?" I said I needed a lawyer. Jorlan had been practicing family law in Minneapolis for 15 years. His record in grandparent rights cases specifically was strong, with a win rate that his office did not advertise, but that my research confirmed. Lars found him through a colleague and made the introduction. I met with Jorlan alone for the first appointment, because I wanted to be certain I was choosing him for my reasons and not Lars's. The first meeting lasted an hour and 40 minutes. Jorlan read through the documents Lars had compiled, as well as the additional records I brought. 2 years of bank statements, the hospital payment plan agreement, my EBT approval letter, Donna's written account of the childcare arrangement, and a written timeline I had prepared the night before of every significant event from November of the previous year forward. When he finished reading, he looked up and said, "Your father made a strategic mistake by mentioning grandparent rights at the door. That tells me he already consulted someone before he came to your apartment. This was not an impulsive visit." That sentence stayed with me for a long time after I left his office. Jorlin laid out 3 immediate steps. The first was to establish a formal co-parenting agreement with Lars through the court, which would legally define custody, visitation, and decision-making authority. This agreement would serve as the foundational document protecting my primary parental rights before any outside party attempted to use the courts to gain access to Leia. The second was to send a formal legal notice to my father outlining the conditions under which any contact with Leia would be considered, and making clear that any action outside those conditions would be opposed. The third was to begin building and organizing the full evidentiary record, everything I had from the past 2 years, into a format that could be presented in court if necessary. Lars and I met with Jorlin 3 separate times over the following 2 weeks to finalize the co-parenting agreement. Every session was straightforward. Lars held primary residential custody as joint with me. I held sole legal decision-making authority, with Lars having joint rights in medical and educational matters, and a protection clause stated that no extended family member from either side could have unsupervised contact with Leia without both parents agreeing in writing. Lars signed every page without requesting a single modification. When Jorlin asked if he had any amendments to propose, Lars said, "Whatever Thessaly decides is the right decision." Jorlin looked at him for a moment and then wrote that down in his notes. I signed the agreement on a Wednesday afternoon. My hand did not shake. I had not felt that degree of steadiness in 2 years. Jorlin sent the formal legal notice to my father by certified mail the following week. The letter stated plainly that any request for contact with Leia must be submitted in writing through legal counsel, that any direct approach to my home, my phone, or my person would be documented and considered harassment, and that a complete evidentiary record of the past 22 months was already on file and available for court review. My father did not respond for 10 days. On the 11th day, he called my phone directly. I let it go to voicemail. The message said he wanted to work something out and asked if I could arrange for him to see the baby. He used the word arrange as though he were asking me to schedule a meeting with a colleague. He did not reference the letter. He did not reference Jorlin. He spoke as though the legal notice had not happened. I called Jorlin. Jorlin called my father's attorney, whom my father had apparently retained the previous week. The attorneys communicated. A proposal came back. My father wanted to pursue a mediated agreement for regular grandparent visitation. Jorlin presented me with 3 options. I chose the most structured one, a conditional reconciliation process with specific requirements my father had to meet before any contact with Leia would be scheduled. The conditions were as follows. He was required to complete a minimum of 12 sessions with a licensed therapist, chosen by me from a list of approved providers. He was required to submit a written account, acknowledging each specific action he had taken from the night he told me to pack my things onward, not a general apology, but a documented acknowledgement of individual decisions and their consequences. And any first contact with Leia had to occur in a supervised setting with both me and Lars present, scheduled no less than 7 days in advance. My father's attorney communicated his acceptance after 11 days of back and forth. The therapy sessions began the following month. His therapist was required to confirm attendance and general progress to Jorlin without disclosing session content, which was standard for this type of agreement. For the first 6 weeks, the confirmations came in consistently. He was attending. He was not cancelling. The written acknowledgement took 4 weeks to produce. It arrived through Jorlin's office in a sealed envelope. I read it at Jorlin's desk with Jorlin in the room. It was 3 pages. It named specific dates. It named the temperature that night. It named the amount of money I had in my account. It named the hospital. I read every word. Then I folded it and put it in the folder with the other documents. I did not feel relief. I felt like I was reading a legal record of something that had happened to a person, and that person was me, and someone had finally written it down officially. The first supervised visit was scheduled for a Saturday morning in a public park near my apartment. The visit was 30 minutes. My father arrived 5 minutes early. He brought a stuffed rabbit. He sat on the ground and let Leia approach him at her own pace. She was curious but not warm. She was 2 years old. She did not know who he was. She called him the man because that was the most accurate thing available to her. I sat 15 feet away on a bench. Lars stood near the path. We did not speak during the 30 minutes. When the time was up, I called Leia over, and my father stood and nodded at me and left. 3 more visits followed over the next 10 weeks. He arrived on time for each one. He did not attempt to extend the visits beyond the scheduled window. He did not attempt to speak to me beyond a brief greeting. He followed every condition. I began to think, cautiously, that perhaps the process was doing what it was designed to do. I was wrong. The call from Jorlin came on a Tuesday afternoon in the 7th month after the supervised visits had begun. I was at the kitchen table studying for a midterm when my phone rang. Jorlin did not open with small talk. He said, "Your father filed a petition for court-ordered grandparent visitation rights this morning with the Hennepin County Family Court." I put down my pencil. I sat still for a moment. I said, "Tell me what we need to do." Jorlin explained the legal framework. Under Minnesota statute, a grandparent may petition the court for visitation rights if they can demonstrate that a meaningful relationship with the grandchild already exists and that denying continued contact would harm the child's best interests. My father's strategy, as Jorlin outlined it, had been methodical. He had used the 7 months of supervised visits to establish documented contact, had photographed or logged each visit, and was now presenting that record to the court as evidence of an existing relationship that should not be severed. He had planned for this from the beginning. Every visit had been a data point. Every stuffed animal and every on-time arrival had been part of a legal argument he was building in real time. 2 days later, Zephan called. My brother's voice was different from how it usually sounded. He spoke slowly and carefully, the way people speak when they are carrying something they have been holding for too long. He said, "Tess, I need to tell you something. Dad has been texting me for months. He thought I was on his side." Zephan had not corrected that assumption. He had kept his responses neutral and let my father believe the alliance was intact, and my father had used those text threads to outline his plan in detail. Zephan read the messages to me one by one. In a message sent the week before the first supervised visit, my father had written to Zephan, "The key is consistency. Every visit on time, no overreach, let her think the process is working." In a message after the 3rd visit he wrote, "She is starting to relax her guard. Keep track of what I tell you, it may be relevant." In a message sent the night before filing the petition, 3 days before Zephan called me, he wrote, "We have enough." 7 months of documented contact, 3 photographs per visit, a log of every interaction. The attorney says it is sufficient to petition. Do not say anything to Thessaly. He had written "we" in that last message, as though Zephan were his partner in it. Zephan had read that final message and made his decision. He took screenshots of every message in the thread dating back 9 months and emailed them to me that same night. He said on the phone, "I should have told you the moment I understood what he was doing. I did not know how to do it in a way that helped you instead of making things worse. I am sorry for the delay." I told him I understood. I told him I was glad he called. Then I sent the screenshots to Jorlin within the hour. Jorlin's response came back at 11:45 p.m. "This changes everything." The 3 weeks that followed were the most intensive of the entire process. Jorlin and his team worked with the full evidentiary package. The original 2 years of documentation, the written acknowledgement my father had submitted through the mediation process, the attendance records from the therapy requirement, the text messages Zephan had provided, and a formal statement I wrote over the course of 4 days detailing every interaction with my father since the night he told me to leave, including the doorway conversation where he had mentioned grandparent rights within 90 seconds of arrival. Zephan agreed to testify. He told me on a Sunday phone call, "I should have called you that night 2 years ago. I heard things in the house and I did not come downstairs. I have thought about that a lot." I told him, "I know." We stayed on the phone quietly for a minute after that. Neither of us tried to resolve the 2 years that sentence represented. There would be time for that later. Lars reviewed every document Jorlin sent him and signed each one. He asked once if I wanted him present at the hearing. I said yes. He said, "I will be there." The night before the court date, I put Leia to bed at her usual time. I sat in the $12 rocking chair after she fell asleep. The chair had a loose joint on the left side now, and it creaked on every forward motion. I sat in it anyway. I thought about the night in the hospital when I had held Leia for the first time and cried because I was no longer falling. I thought about what it had taken to get from that hospital bed to this apartment, to this court date, to this moment. I did not feel afraid. I felt ready. I was awake at 5 in the morning on the day of the hearing. I dressed in a navy outfit I had purchased specifically for the occasion, pulled my hair back and did not put on jewelry. I made Leia her usual breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast cut into 4 pieces. I told her I had something to do this morning and that Donna was coming to spend time with her and I would be back by the afternoon. Leia said okay and asked if she could bring her stuffed dog to Donna's. I said yes. Donna arrived at 7:30. She hugged me at the door without saying anything about where I was going. I thanked her and left. Lars was already outside with the car. Zephan was in the back seat. The drive to the courthouse took 19 minutes. No one spoke much. At one point Zephan said, "You are not alone today." I looked out the window and nodded. We arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled start. My father was already in the waiting area when I walked through the door. He was sitting in a chair near the far wall with his attorney. He looked up when I entered. I did not stop. I walked past him and went directly to where Jorlan was standing near the courtroom entrance. Jorlan reviewed the outline with me one final time. He said, "Stay calm, stay factual, let the record speak." I said I understood. The hearing began at 9 a.m. Jorlan opened with the foundational history. He walked the court through the timeline from November of the year I was 20, the evening conversation, the 2-hour instruction to pack, the temperature outside that night, the amount of money in my account, the shelter, the hospital bill, the 22 months of documented solo caregiving. He placed the evidentiary folder into the record and had each document identified and logged. My father's attorney argued that his client had demonstrated a genuine change of intent through 7 months of consistent, appropriate behavior during supervised visits. He presented the visit logs, the photographs, the attendance records from the therapy requirement. He argued that an ongoing relationship had been established and that Leia's best interests were served by its continuation. Jorlan did not dispute the attendance or the behavior during visits. Instead, he placed the text messages into evidence. He read each relevant message aloud in sequence, stating the date, the recipient, and the content. The courtroom was quiet during the reading. When he reached the message that said she is starting to relax her guard, he paused for 2 seconds and then continued. When he reached the message that said we have enough, he read it once, placed the printout face up on the evidence table and moved on. Then Zephan was called to testify. My father's attorney attempted to establish during cross-examination that Zephan had a personal bias against his father, stemming from family conflict unrelated to the petition. Zephan answered each question directly and without elaboration. He confirmed that his relationship with his father had been strained, but stated that the messages he had provided were accurate transcriptions, verifiable against the original phone records which had been subpoenaed and confirmed. When asked why he had chosen to provide the messages to my legal team, Zephan said, "Because what he was doing was wrong, and she is my sister." The judge reviewed the submitted materials for 20 minutes following the close of testimony. The courtroom was quiet except for the ambient sound of the building. The ruling was read aloud at 11:22 a.m. The petition for court-ordered grandparent visitation was denied in full. The judge's written findings, summarized verbally from the bench, stated that the petition had been filed on the basis of a manufactured evidentiary record, that the documented communications demonstrated the supervised visitation process had been entered into not in good faith, but as a deliberate strategy to create the appearance of an existing relationship for litigation purposes, and that granting the petition under these circumstances would not serve the best interests of the child and would reward conduct the court, was not prepared to endorse. My father sat in his chair and did not move when the ruling was read. I gathered my documents from the table, shook Jorlan's hand and thanked him. I did not look in my father's direction. I walked out of the courtroom. Zephan was on my left, Lars was on my right. Outside the building the October air was cool and the sky was clear. Nobody spoke for a moment, then I said, "I want to go pick up Leia." We got in the car. 6 months later, life looked nothing like it had looked at any point in the previous 2.5 years. I completed my first semester at the community college with a 3.8 grade average. I was awarded a partial academic scholarship for the following semester. I enrolled immediately. Leia was 2.5 years old. She spoke in full sentences and could count to 10 in English and was beginning to learn numbers in Swedish from Lars. Every evening we sat in the rocking chair, which now had a creak on both sides because the second joint had loosened, but which still held both of us without any real danger of collapse. Lars had relocated to Minneapolis permanently, having restructured his professional responsibilities to allow remote management. He rented an apartment 12 minutes from mine on foot. He and I had not defined what we were to each other beyond co-parents, and we were not in a rush to do so. What we had built was honest and stable, and those two things were enough for the present. Zephan was in the process of transferring his work contract to Minneapolis. He and I spoke on the phone every week. We had not yet sat down and talked through the night 2.5 years ago, the night he had heard something downstairs and had not come down. We both knew that conversation was ahead of us. We were letting it find the right time. My mother had called once in the months following the hearing. The call lasted 4 minutes. She said she wanted to know how I was doing. I told her I was well. She asked about Leah. I said Leah was well. She did not mention my father. I did not mention him either. When the call ended, I sat with it for a while and decided that I did not yet know what I wanted that relationship to be. That was an honest place to be, and I was comfortable staying there until I had more clarity. My father sent a letter through Jorland's office 3 weeks after the hearing. It was brief. It said, "I hope Leah is well." It was not an apology. It did not address anything that had happened. I read it once, folded it and placed it in the document folder with the rest of the record. I did not reply. I did not know if I ever would. The honest answer was that I had no obligation to decide that today. On a Saturday morning 6 months after the court date, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Leah was on the living room floor stacking blocks. Lars was in the chair across from me with his own coffee, reading something on his phone. The apartment was quiet in the way that only apartments with small children are quiet, which means it was not actually quiet, but it was calm. I looked at the two of them. I looked at the rocking chair against the wall. I thought about the thrift store where I had paid $12 for it on a cold afternoon when Leah was 6 weeks old. I thought about every night I had sat in it and made the decision not to quit. I had built this. Not alone, not anymore, but the foundation had been mine. Every terrible thing that had happened had failed to be the last word. That was not luck and it was not magic. It was a series of decisions I had made on days when making them was the hardest thing available to me. I want to say something to you directly if you have stayed with this story until now. The people who were supposed to protect you will not always do that. And that truth is one of the hardest things a person can absorb, but it does not mean you are not worth protecting. It means you have to be the one who does it first, who shows up for yourself before anyone else arrives, who builds the foundation before the house can stand. That is not a consolation. That is the actual work, and it is possible. I am evidence that it is possible. If this story reached something in you today, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts in the comments. What part of this stayed with you? Have you ever been in a situation where someone used a legal process to manipulate rather than to resolve something honestly? Or have you been the person who had to rebuild from a starting point that someone else chose for you without your consent? Share your experience below. Every comment you leave tells me that this kind of story matters to people, and that is what keeps me coming back to tell more of them. If you found value in this story, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it today. A share takes 10 seconds and it can reach someone who is in the middle of their own version of this story and does not yet know there is a way through it. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is a good moment to do that. There are more stories coming, and each one is built on the same principle, the truth of what people actually live through, told without softening the parts that are hard. Thank you for spending this time here. I mean that without any performance. You chose to sit with a difficult story for its full length, and that is not a small thing. Take care of yourself this week, and I will see you in the next one.